Hi there. As a pastor, I often get the question, what's this original language of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, that we translate our English Bible from? Where does the English Bible come from? What are we using as original sources? We know that these Old Testament people didn't speak English, so how did we end up with an English Bible? Well, the whole thing has to do with manuscripts. And these manuscripts were handwritten. This was before the time of the printing press. And there are three basic sources for the Old Testament. These are manuscript families from which we translate into English what we know as the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. Now, a lot of people say, well, in the original Hebrew. Now, Hebrew was the mother tongue of the Hebrew people, the nation of Israel, that we associate with Saul, David, and Solomon, and all the people before and after. And after 587 BC, that kingdom came to an end. The Babylonians destroyed the temple and took the people of Israel out into captivity in Babylon. Now, I'm going to simplify this. Those of you who are scholars are going to say, well, there's this and there's that and there's this and there's that, and you really ought to be more precise about this. But I am doing this video for people who are beginners with this topic, so I have to keep it simple enough so that they have a basic understanding. So from about the time 1000 BC, the time of David, to 587 BC, we have a whole bunch of the books of the Bible put together during that time, written in Hebrew. The problem is, after 587, the people of David's tribe, Judah, were taken off into captivity in Babylon, and the language of the Babylonians was Aramaic. And over time, the Hebrew language disappeared as a spoken daily language that you would use in the marketplace, that you would use at home, that you would use in conversations with regular people, kind of like how Latin became in North America, where it was used sometimes for liturgy and those kinds of things, but it really wasn't used by anybody to speak to anybody. So even though the Roman Catholic Church used Latin in their liturgy, there were no Roman Catholic priests speaking Latin to each other. It was no longer a living language, and nobody bought a pound of butter using Latin. And the same thing happened to Hebrew after 587. Over time, the language disappeared as a spoken, used language by people. And so what happened is, in the book of Daniel, you've got this shift going on between Hebrew and Aramaic. There's some chapters of the book of Daniel that are written in Aramaic. And after that, most of the people in the Holy Land spoke Aramaic or Greek if they were Gentiles. And even Jews started speaking a lot of Greek. And so depending on how far you were from Jerusalem, the chances are that if you were Jewish, you were speaking Greek. Now, especially this had to do with the town of Alexandria, the city of Alexandria, I should say, one of the most learned cities in the world, the home of the great library. And a few centuries before Jesus, so a few centuries after 587, when most of the people in the area we know of as Israel were beginning to speak Aramaic, in Alexandria, the Jews were speaking Greek. And they didn't have a Hebrew Bible, an Old Testament, to read. They had only the Hebrew to read and a little bit of Aramaic from Daniel and some other things. And so basically they had to translate the Bible from Hebrew into Greek so they could read it. Now, this Greek Bible was called the Septuagint, or LXX for 70. There was 70 or 70-some translators or whatever. There's a lot of legend around that. You can look it up on your own. But in any case, they created this really good version of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. Now, you had then a Hebrew Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, a Greek Old Testament, and you had these two different versions of the Bible. Of course, the Hebrew would be used mostly for liturgy and for study by scholars, and the Greek would be used in normal conversation because that's what people were speaking. There was also something called the Targums. The Targums are paraphrases of the Hebrew Old Testament in Aramaic for the regular language of the people. So if you were in the Holy Land, the time of Jesus, where the people were speaking Aramaic, they would go to the synagogue and they would perhaps read from the scrolls in Hebrew, but then they would read from the Targums, which were Aramaic explanations and paraphrases of the Hebrew, for the regular folks to be able to read. So you had Aramaic, you had Greek, you had Hebrew, and all these things. Now, over time, over many, many centuries, we had these manuscripts. These are not printed Bibles. These are handwritten Bibles called manuscripts, handwritten. And these manuscript Bibles were all over the place. And very often when Jews were persecuted, and that happened a lot, and it still happens today, their Torah scrolls were burned. If you look at the end of the Fiddler on the Roof movie, you see the town destroyed, and that happened a lot. And the first thing they go after is the Hebrew scrolls. Well, Greek scrolls didn't look Jewish to a lot of people, so a lot of them survived. And here's what we have. When we're translating the Bible into English from the ancient languages, from Hebrew, from Aramaic, and from Greek, we have choices of manuscripts. And here's the big problem. Our oldest complete manuscript of the Old Testament in Hebrew, the oldest one we have, is only 1,000 years old. And it's called Codex Leningrad, and it's in the city of St. Petersburg, which used to be called Leningrad. And that's the oldest copy we have of a complete Hebrew Bible. So it's only 1,000 years old, and this stuff goes back, the stories go back 3,000 plus years. And so we don't have any full copies of the Hebrew Bible that are older than that codex, than that manuscript. And that's a problem, because that's a long time from the time these stories happened and these events happened and people wrote them down. So that's a real challenge compared to the New Testament, where we have just a few generations between the action and the actual writing down of the New Testament. So going back to the Old Testament, we've got Codex Leningrad, and I'm going to spare you the Latin name for that, just call it Codex Leningrad. And we also have the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament. Now the oldest copy we have is called Codex Sinai, and that is from 400, the 4th century, in there somewhere. We're not exactly sure with these manuscripts, but it's about 600 years older than Leningrad. So ironically, the Hebrew Bible, from which the Greek was translated, our oldest copies of a complete Old Testament are in Greek, not in Hebrew, because we have an older manuscript, and that manuscript is called the Septuagint, and we have a full Old Testament in Codex Sinai. And that was found at a monastery in Sinai. So we've got these two copies that are full copies of the Old Testament. Those are the two oldest copies we have of the complete Old Testament. We also have a lot of the Targums. The Targums are Aramaic paraphrases, translations of the Old Testament for the people who spoke Aramaic like Jesus did in the New Testament times in the 1st century. And so we have a lot of those floating around too, and they vary a lot. They are very much free translations. You look at the creation story and there's all kinds of things added to it, and sort of explanations and paraphrases and artistic flourishes and all that kind of stuff. And so the Targums help us some, but in other ways they're kind of challenging because they don't agree with each other. So we've got Sinai and we've got Leningrad, and we have something else. After 1947, they started finding what's called the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the Qumran Scrolls. And these scrolls are super, super important. Why? Because they're from like the 1st century, give or take. They're by far the oldest versions of the Old Testament we have. Now, this is new. Now, the problem is we don't have a complete Old Testament from the Dead Sea Scrolls. We've got a really good scroll from Isaiah, we've got a pretty good one from Samuel and a few others, but we're missing big parts of the Old Testament. And so we've got 3 major sources. For instance, I'm working on 1 Samuel right now, so I'm looking at the Masoretic Text, which is what they call Codex Leningrad and the ones related to that. That's called the Masoretic Text, and we won't get into the whole history of why it's called that. That's the Hebrew text from 1,000 years ago. We've got Codex Sinai, which is the Greek text, which is about 1,600 years old. And we also have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are about 2,000 years old. So they're the oldest, closest to the original writing. And they're amazingly close to the Septuagint and to Codex Leningrad, which we sort of lump together with the Masoretic text. So you've got 3 sources plus the Targums. So you've got the Dead Sea Scrolls, you've got the Septuagint, and you've got the Masoretic text, or the Hebrew text. Now, these 3 sources are that which we pull together our translations into English. Now, the truth is, because of archaeology, we have a lot more manuscripts than we used to when they translated, for instance, Luther's Bible in the 1500s or the King James Version in the 1600s. So we actually have better manuscripts, more faithful manuscripts from before those were ever written. And so we have a better textual representation from these centuries. So we have more to work with, so to speak, to get at the original text as best we can. We don't have any original text, but we want to work our way back as best we can. And in general, the older, the better. The older a text is, the better, and the closer it is to the original manuscript of whoever was writing these books of the Bible. And we want to work our way back to that. Now, here's the problem. A lot of people have been favoring the Masoretic text for a long time, and there's good reasons to do that. And I know all those arguments as far as that goes. And there's a good reason to just take the Masoretic text and translate what it says. But the truth is, it's not nearly as old as our Septuagint copy, our Greek copy, and not nearly as old as our Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the problem with Dead Sea Scrolls is we don't have the entire Old Testament. So if I'm translating 1 Samuel, which I'm working on right now, I start with the Masoretic text, and if I run into trouble, I look at the Greek, the Septuagint, because the Septuagint can often help explain something that doesn't make sense, because it was translated before the time of Christ into Greek, and those people are way closer to the original than I am. And so I can trust them as translators as far as that goes. So you've got the Greek helping to explain the Hebrew, but then you've got the Hebrew in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And now when the Hebrew in the Dead Sea Scrolls agrees with the Septuagint and disagrees with the Masoretic text, I don't know for sure, but my tendency is to go with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Greek Septuagint against the Masoretic text, because both of those are older, and if they agree, that says something. So actually, if we're going after the truth, or we're going after the most original documents possible, we want to be doing stuff just like that. So that's an answer to you. Let me review. The Masoretic text, which we associate with Codex Leningrad, is the oldest complete Hebrew Bible we have. The Septuagint, Codex Sinai, is the oldest complete Greek manuscript we have of the Old Testament. And that is some 600 years older than Codex Leningrad, even though it was translated from a previous version of Hebrew, which we don't have. And the oldest of all are the Dead Sea Scrolls. Unfortunately, we don't have a complete version of the Old Testament in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we've got some really good stuff to work from. And so we've got these three sources plus the Targums. And we could go on. And please have some generosity with me if you're one of those scholars who wants to point out all kinds of details. But the purpose of this is not to give people granular details, but to give you a sweeping history of how you got your English Old Testament. I hope you've enjoyed this. Please pass this on to others. I realize it's a very simplified version of the story, but you can start from the simplified version, do your own self-study, and add details as you need to, and I'll talk to you again real soon.